Dear friends, I will now proceed with what I said I would do a while ago and what I repeated in my introductory statement the day before yesterday. I will give you a verbal account of the 4 or 5 most important aspects in my criminal complaint, the one that I filed with the equivalent of the U.S. Attorney General's office. So, since I've been a trial lawyer for 35 years, I decided why not also go ahead and give you a verbal account of what's written in that criminal complaint. Now, if I were to do this in chronological order, I should have to start with my kidnapping and the failed attempts to disguise this first as a deportation, that is, Mexico wants to get me out of the country, and then after I had been officially arrested in Germany at Frankfurt Airport, as an extradition, that is, Germany wanting to take me from Mexico. That in itself is a wild story, but the most interesting question that arises from this wild story is, of course, who is responsible for this crime? Who is behind this? Who called the shots? The answer to this question is also the key to the case against the puppets, whom I'm accusing of a whole truckload of very serious crimes in my criminal complaint. But it is also the key to a civil proceeding for damages. And I guarantee you that this will be one of the most expensive tort cases for damages ever, as it will not only be filed for myself, but also for all those whose complaints for damages I was not able to file because of my kidnapping. That is, all those potential class action members who suffered physical and or economic damages because of the shots and the lockdowns. And this will automatically lead to those who are behind the pandemic. All of them, both the monsters hiding behind the puppets and the puppets themselves, are now in complete disarray, as you can see from the almost frantically crazy activities of, for example, the EU's puppet leaders in France, Germany, and the UK, and, of course, in Ukraine, with respect to getting the EU involved in a war against Russia. Looks like now the time has come for their throwing each other under the bus. That's how serious the situation now is for them. Therefore, please bear with me and allow me to use this chronologically first and most important part of the crimes detailed in my criminal account, the kidnapping in Mexico. Allow me to use it as a cliffhanger. Allow me to save this best part of the story for last and start with the complete destruction of the completely false arrest warrant of March 15th, 2023 on November the 1st, 2023. This arrest warrant was issued against me on March 15th, 2023 in a brazen violation of the European Union's law of the land, its highest law. And that is spelt out in a decision by the European Union's Court of Justice dated May 27, 2019. That decision states that German prosecutors, because they have to follow German politicians' orders, cannot and must not issue European arrest warrants. They are mere political puppets. You will easily understand that ruling once you know how it came to this arrest warrant. Then that ruling, as I just outlined, it will be self-explanatory. And how both judges and prosecutors in my case tried to do everything to keep the illegal and totally false arrest warrant in place and me in prison, even after we had, on November the 1st, 2023, been able to show that every single one of the allegations contained therein was false. So how did it come to the issuance of that arrest warrant on March 15th, 2023? As you will remember, the German deep state, the rogue domestic intelligence service, Constitutional Protection Agency, had directly approached the Göttingen DA's office as early as December of 2021 asking them to invent a criminal offense that I could be accused of, and pointing out that I was a conspiracy theorist who was not only looking into the corona pandemic, but who was also the owner of my own very effective international law firm and the leader of a new political party, which had nominated me as their candidate for chancellor. And I was the face of the Corona Investigative Committee. As you'll also remember, this first attempt to take me down, this direct attempt, this direct approach by that rogue intelligence service of the DA's office in Göttingen, this first attempt to take me down because of the political role I seemed to be playing and the international relevance of the Corona Investigative Committee, whose frontman I was, had failed. It had failed because the one holdout, the one supporter of the rule of law and democracy at the Göttingen DA's office, a senior prosecutor by the name of Reiner, refused to even open a criminal investigation against me because she, after a detailed preliminary investigation, couldn't find anything of criminal relevance in what I and the Corona Investigative Committee was doing. Rather, she found we did exactly what we had promised the donors to do, and that is investigate the pandemic and the government's overreach, which, she writes on June 14, 2022, was intended to lead to a sentencing of the government's overreach and suspension of the German people's fundamental rights as enshrined in the German Constitution's guarantees of personal liberties. That is exactly what she wrote in her refusal to even open a criminal investigation against me. And she also wrote, in response to the brazen attempt of the deep state's rogue domestic intelligence services to get her to simply invent criminal charges out of thin air against me, that she, as a prosecutor, she wrote, was not there to blindly follow orders and invent criminal charges against anyone if there was not even a scintilla of substantive evidence to at least indicate that anything of criminal relevance had occurred. This happened on June 14, 2022, and is part of the prosecution's case file, even though it is hidden at the very back so as to hide that there had been a failed attempt by the deep state before they launched that second attempt to go after me by way of getting the 3 Berlin attorneys turned agents for the rogue CPA to file a criminal complaint against me, which happened on September the 2nd, 2022. The criminal complaint of September the 2nd, 2022, it turned out during the trial, consisted of nothing but the most blatant lies, including, of course, that I would go after the author of that complaint with a Winchester rifle because of his ethnic background. That, a former friend of this deeply disturbed and very evil person told the defense and the journalist, was just another blatant lie by this person designed to frame me as a far-right extremist, Nazi, and of course, anti-Semite. So after this digression into the backdrop of that arrest warrant, let's see where we are. The first attempt to take me down failed on June 14, 2022. That was a direct attempt by the German Domestic Intelligence Service. But almost immediately afterwards, on September the 2nd, 2022, they launched their second attempt to take me down. This time, it was an indirect attack, as it was not the agency itself that addressed the Göttingen DA's office, but their 3 Berlin agents who filed a criminal complaint on September the 2nd, 2022. As you will also remember, this time they played it safe and made sure that the above-mentioned lone holdout for democracy and the rule of law, senior prosecutor Reiner, who was once again in charge of this case, wouldn't be able to shoot down this next brazen attempt as well. How did they do this? By way of transferring their man, inexperienced rookie prosecutor John, from Hanover to Göttingen, and changing the case number so that now he would be in charge and no longer prosecutor Reiner, who, as the case file shows, was already in the process of beginning an investigation into the second attempt to take me down when she was brusquely pushed aside and Junior Prosecutor John was installed to take her place. He, as the case file also shows, did absolutely nothing to investigate this case at all. He even refused to interrogate the three authors of the incredibly amateurish and emotional and obviously false complaint, and also investigate the person who had set them in motion, my former co-host. They, as is written down in that case file by a senior police investigator, were to be interrogated. This is written down on November the 4th, 2022. They were to be interrogated because obviously he understood that there was something terribly wrong with these three signatories of that criminal complaint and with the person who had set them in motion. But Prosecutor John did absolutely nothing. He didn't even try to investigate anything. He did one thing. He just sat there and waited until the three Berlin attorneys turned agents for the rogue German domestic intelligence service had completed the theft of my and my client's money, so that finally their complaint looked like it made sense, like it was plausible, at least so long as you didn't go beyond a cursory glance at this complaint. So as long as you didn't do what that senior police investigator had written down, that is to investigate the authors of this weirdly amateurish and emotional complaint. Interrogate the three authors of the complaint and the person who had set everything in motion, my former co-host. Not to speak of, as even the German law of criminal procedure demands, hear the other side, because that's what they should have done. That is, they should have heard me, the accused, too, audiatur et altera pars. Why was it acutely necessary to hear my side of the story and take a closer look at these four people on the other side? Well, because the signatories of the complaint themselves had attached an email from me to that complaint, which my former co-host had then given to them. And I clearly state in that email that I was in the process of paying back the loan, and that, of course, directly contradicted the other four's claim that I had never intended to pay back the loan. So, of course, none of this happened. Nothing that is even remotely resembling an investigation happened because Senior Prosecutor Reiner, whose case this was, and who had already started to give the second attempt at taking me down a closer look, was taken out of the equation, and rookie Prosecutor John, the deep state's pawn, was put in. He refused to investigate anything, waited until the three Berlin attorneys turned agents of the deep state had completed the theft of more than 1.1 million euros of my money and roughly 400,000 euros of my client's money, sat around for another couple of months, and then finally, on March 15th, filled out a form for a German arrest warrant and then a European arrest warrant, which was solely based, as he himself admits, on the completely false and uninvestigated criminal complaint of the deep state's agents, and therefore just as false as their false criminal complaint. Now, he needed only one more thing to happen. He needed either a comatose judge to auto-sign it, or a judge who would also just follow orders and would blindly sign it, not giving it any look at all. And it was exactly that kind of judge he found, Judge Moog of a lower court in Göttingen. He, without even giving that arrest warrant a cursory look, signed the arrest warrant exactly as written up by Prosecutor John on the very same day, that is March 15th, on the very same day he got it on his desk. So here we are now, almost a year and 2 months after the criminal complaint of September 2nd, 2022 had been filed, 7 months after Prosecutor John had written up the arrest warrant on March 15th, 2023, which had been auto-signed on the same day by Judge Molk, and 2 weeks after I had been kidnapped by the German deep state in Mexico. Finally, on November the 1st, 2023, I was standing in front of a German judge to finally be able to respond to the charges as spelt out in the arrest warrant. Much, much, much too late, and in grave violation of the German law of criminal procedure. But anyway, strangely enough, my attorney Katja Wörmer and I were standing in front of the very same judge who had auto-signed Prosecutor John's totally false arrest warrant, Judge Molk. Understandably enough, of course, he was very, very worried that his criminal part in this saga would now blow him out of the water. And this time, there was no way of this happening behind the scenes without leaving a trace in this public criminal case. At this point, it should be noted, which is something that probably most of you can't believe, but at this point it should be noted that in contrast with Anglo-American law, for example, in Germany, at the regional courts, where very serious crimes are tried, no one records the statements and explanations of the court, the prosecution, the defense, or the witnesses. There is no court reporter who's charged with this task. Rather, incredibly enough, the judge himself can make up and invent stories and statements that have nothing to do whatsoever with what actually happens in his court. And as you'll see in a moment, this is exactly what happened after Judge Molk's attempts to shut me up failed on November the 1st, when Judge Schindler took over on December the 19th of 2023. So what happened on November the 1st? Unlike at the regional courts, there is a court reporter at the lower courts in Germany, so that on November the 1st, there was a court reporter sitting next to the judge, and she wrote down everything that was said so that her minutes would become part of the official case file. Judge Molk was acutely aware of this and did his best to stop me from saying anything. At first, he suggested that my attorney, Katja Wörmer, should go ahead and say whatever she had to say, as I, he said, didn't believe in the integrity of German judges anyway, because I, he said, believed that they were all puppets. I responded by telling him that that was not quite correct, but that I believed that some 80% of the German judges were mere puppets, and that I thought that he was one of these puppets. That kind of set the stage. In response to this, he said that he was absolutely not interested at all in anything I had to say. And once again, he asked Katja Wörmer to speak on my behalf. This insane demeanor even shocked Prosecutor John, who apparently was not used to the rampant corruption of the German legal system that, in the meantime, is so far beyond control that, as you'll see very soon, now even the mainstream media are forced to talk and write about it. I insisted that I was an attorney myself and that I would respond to the charges as made up in Prosecutor John's arrest warrant. I would respond to it myself. So finally, when all else failed, Judge Molk couldn't stop me from speaking out any longer, and the court reporter took everything down in writing in her minutes that I said about the three central allegations contained in that arrest warrant. First, the arrest warrant assumes that the members of the Corona Investigative Committee could only make joint decisions and that they did not have the authority to individually make any decisions for or on behalf of the Corona Investigative Committee. That means Vivian Fischer, my former co-host, and I, who had entered into 3 loan agreements to protect part of the donation money from the government, the deep state seizing that money, had no authority to do that without first consulting with the 2 substitute members of the Corona Investigative Committee. That was wrong, of course, as even a cursory look at the bylaws of the Corona Investigative Committee would have clearly shown to anyone with even half a pulse and at least one eye. Vivian Fischer and I, it says in there, and anyone else, any other shareholder, a member of the Corona Investigative Committee, did have the authority to do what we did without first asking the two substitute and totally inactive members of the Corona Investigative Committee for their approval. The two other members who, as it turned out, were only interested in the donated money for their own private use. In short, allegation number one was clearly and patently false. The court reporter made this become part of her minutes. The second allegation in the arrest warrant is that I simply took 200,000 euro in donations by stealing or embezzling it. That was wrong too, because there was, of course, a loan agreement for this, and this loan contract had become part of the Corona Investigative books. It was there, transparently, out in the open. Also, attorney Tobias Weisenborn had explained this to the prosecution only a couple of days before my kidnapping, and it was therefore part of the prosecution's case file, too. Both Judge Moog and Prosecutor John had turned pale at this time. Even I, despite of my red-green weakness, could see that. Thirdly and crucially, Prosecutor John and Judge Moog's arrest warrant alleges that I had from the outset neither been willing nor able to pay back the loan. By the way, nothing else is spelt out in that arrest warrant, not a word of a secret trust agreement or any such nonsense that was later invented by Judge Schindler, just loans. Now that, too, that I had from the outset neither been willing nor able to pay back the loan was a blatant lie, as both my email attached to the Three Stooges criminal complaint shows, and as Judge Schindler later had to grudgingly admit when all the witnesses had confirmed that I had always been willing to pay back the loan and that I had much more than enough money to pay it back. Until, of course, the Three Stooges, aided and abetted by Prosecutor John, had stolen my money plus my client's money. Anyway, all of this, my entire testimony, was now in the court reporter's minutes and therefore in the case file, despite all those desperate attempts of Judge Moog to keep me from testifying at all. This caused sheer panic in both John and Moog, and John ran out of the courtroom. To do what? Well, to frantically call Vivian Fisher's attorney, a former senior prosecutor, right after this catastrophic hearing had ended. How do we know this? Because a letter written by this former prosecutor turned attorney for Vivian Fisher, dated November 12, 23, starts out by saying, "Dear Mr. Prosecutor John, with reference to the telephone conversation held on November the 1st, 2023, and so on. The relevance of this letter will become obvious to you when I explain how Judge Schindler, when he later realized that the prosecution's attempt to take me down because of illegal loans had failed, invented completely new charges on May the 3rd of 2024. However, when this testimony had been put into writing, when this was in the minutes, Judge Moog was forced to squash the arrest warrant, his and Prosecutor John's arrest warrant, maybe make a paper plane out of it and throw it out the window, and of course set me free, as there were no other allegations except those we had just destroyed. But Moog didn't do that. In keeping with what we just saw Göttingen's criminal justice system do with respect to a 16-year-old girl's murder by an asylum seeker, remember they covered it up by lying with the help of Göttingen's newspapers that it had been either a tragic accident or a suicide and let the murderer go. In keeping with that MO, Judge Moog didn't do anything but kept me incarcerated in pretrial detention for a crime which he now knew for a fact I didn't commit, but that had been freely invented by the signatories of the false criminal complaint and their co-conspirator, Prosecutor John. So the defense and I moved for a so-called detention review hearing to finally get me released by the trial court, that is, by Judge Schindler's court. Surely, we thought, Judge Moog was a criminal idiot, but that could not be true for the experienced trial court. After all, the minutes of the hearing before Judge Moog had become part of a case file, and since the defense had a copy of those minutes, it would be impossible to make them disappear by cleaning up that case file. Well, we were wrong again. Judge Schindler, as it turned out, was just as criminal as Judge Moog. First, he tried to dodge that detention review hearing altogether by attempting to do it in writing without me or the defense being able to make any oral statements before the court. Then, when Katja Wörmer explicitly asked for an oral hearing and he couldn't avoid that any longer, he scheduled an oral hearing before the full court for December 19th, 2023, with all three professional judges of the panel, but without the lay judges, the jury. This time, we were determined to make sure that our destruction of the arrest warrant would be heard in detail, and both my defense lawyers, Katja Wörmer and Dagmar Schön, and myself argued our case for almost an hour and a half, that is from 10:05 a.m. until 11:27 a.m., as the minutes of that hearing show. This time, we were determined to make sure that our destruction of the arrest warrant would be heard in every little detail, and both my defense lawyers, Katja Wörmer and Dagmar Schön, and myself argued our case for almost an hour and a half, that is from 10:05 a.m. until 11:27 a.m., as the minutes of that hearing show. Surely, now that we had explained everything to the court, even how my money and my client's money had been stolen by the three signatories of the criminal complaint so as to make their otherwise amateurish and emotional criminal complaint at least look plausible if you only gave it a cursory look, surely now the court would finally throw the case out and let me go. No such luck, however. Absolutely nothing, absolutely not one single word of what we had explained to the court, this time in even greater detail than before criminal Judge Moog, appeared in criminal Judge Schindler's minutes. Remember, there is no court reporter who writes everything that is being said down in the higher court. It was only Judge Schindler who pretended to take notes, and the only sentence you find in his minutes of that hearing of December 19th is this: the facts and the law were discussed. That's all. Now I was warned. I was on high alert, and I realized that something was very wrong with the Göttingen criminal justice system. They were indeed, with the exception of that senior prosecutor Reinicke, mere puppets of the deep state. Just as the New York Times article of 2022 and CBS's 60 Minutes report, and now they're lying about the murder of a 16-year-old girl, already showed. Stay tuned for my next statement. See you all.